Welcome to the March 2019 safety meeting on asbestos and benzene awareness. In this safety meeting, we'll review incidents from February. We'll also review our observation card data for the year. We'll discuss asbestos awareness, which is found in our Safety Compliance Standard 2.14. We'll discuss benzene awareness from Safety Compliance Standard 2.13. Our driving topic this month will be journey management. And then, as always, we'll have a time for you to discuss any health, safety, and environmental topics that you'd like. Let's take a look at our incidents from February of this year. Before we get into our incidents in February, I'd like to discuss the Fatal 4, or OSHA's deadliest categories for workplace fatalities. Struck by objects only accounts for 10% of fatalities in the Fatal 4. However, this category represents the widest range of individual events, consisting of being struck by an object, falling objects, swinging objects, slipping objects, or rolling objects. Body positioning and line of fire are categories where you would typically find struck by object events. Body positioning is a primary contributing factor in 29% of all Wildcat Oil Tools events and a secondary contributing factor in 32% of them. Body positioning also represents 17% of our observations, specifically line of fire being represented by 8%. Generally speaking, to protect yourself and others, make sure you're always wearing the proper PPE for the environment you're working in. Also, only operate equipment you're properly trained and authorized to use. You should also ensure that all safety devices function properly. For rolling objects, make sure you check vehicles to ensure they are in a safe operating condition. Never walk in front of moving equipment and never obstruct the vision by overloading equipment. Also, use extra caution around corners and near doorways. You can protect yourself from falling objects by properly storing loose materials, especially overhead, securing all loads and lifting them evenly, and ensuring workers at elevated heights do not throw objects or tools to each other. In order to keep yourself and others safe from swinging or slipping objects, ensure loads are secure and lifted evenly. Also, do not perform any work under suspended loads and keep a safe distance from them as well. You should inspect all cranes and hoists to ensure that the components are in good condition, and also not exceed the lifting capacity of any cranes or hoists. To protect yourself from flying objects, make sure you inspect tools such as saws, lathes, and other to ensure that protective guards are in place and in good condition. You should wear face shields and safety glasses to prevent injury from chips or particles that are ejected by the equipment. As you can see from this graph, we had 6 incidents in February. When you look at the days of the week where the events happen, it's clear that Monday is the most frequent day of occurrence at 45%. In February, 67% of our events happened on Monday. This is different from 2018, where we saw Wednesday as the most frequent day of incidents. The type of incidents we're seeing in 2019 are most commonly vehicle incidents at 45%. 22% of our events have been near hits. We've had 1 in January and 1 in February, which is great. Our injury events continue to be all first aid style events. Looking at the classification of our incidents in 2019, we see that 34% of our events have been first aid types of events. We did have 1 first aid in February. 44% of our events have been vehicular in nature. We had 1 preventable vehicle incident and 2 non-preventable vehicle incidents in the month of February. 22% have been classified as NA, and that is where we find our near hits. We had 1 near hit in January and 1 near hit in February, which are great and provide us an opportunity to learn for free. Please continue submitting and looking for near hits so we can continue to learn from this valuable experience. When we look into the primary contributing factors for our incidents, we see that body positioning has been identified as a primary contributing factor in 33% of our events in February. You'll remember from previous slides, body positioning is one of the Fatal 4 identified activities from the OSHA Fatal 4. 44% of primary contributing factors were vehicular incidents. We see that denoted in 33% of driver inattention and 11% as struck by third party. The remaining 22% of primary contributing factors represent a failure to understand or implement a proper plan or procedure. Our JSA and our SOPs exist to answer questions and help with the planning process. Please use them or get with your supervisor if you don't understand them. A summary of incidents from February of 2019 show that we had 1 first aid incident out of Carlsbad, we had a near hit out of Carlsbad, we had a preventable vehicle incident out of Kilgore, and we had 2 non-preventable vehicle incidents, 1 out of Carlsbad and 1 out of Waynesburg. Looking at these events in more detail, we'll begin in Carlsbad with our near hit that happened on February 1st, 2019. We had an employee breaking apart a swivel on location. The employee failed to bleed off pressure prior to breaking the swivel apart, causing fluid, in this case water, to be sprayed out, splashing the employee in the face. There were no complications or injuries resulting from the event, and work resumed and concluded without further issue. Causal factors were that work procedures were not followed. Our procedure calls for bleeding pressure off of the swivel prior to breaking out. Corrective actions here are to ensure that all pressure is bled off of pressurized equipment prior to breaking a connection. Our next event happened on February 14th, 2019, and was a first aid event out of Carlsbad. An employee was welding and lifted their welding hood to clean their latest weld by breaking the slag with a hammer. While doing this, debris got into the employee's eye. The employee was wearing safety glasses at the time, but was unable to wear a face shield due to the fact they were wearing a welding hood. Debris was washed from the employee's eye with no further complications. Causal factors here are body positioning. This underscores the ease with which our eyes can be injured. The employee here was doing the best they could given their work task. They were wearing a welding helmet, which made it impossible to wear a face shield with their safety glasses. The next event we'll look at is a preventable vehicle incident on February 18th out of our Kilgore facility. Our employee was on location waiting for the customer to be ready for them to begin their work. The employee had been there around an hour and a half before it was time for him to start. At this point, the employee began to position his vehicle, but a suction hose had been run across location which limited access to the area he needed to be. The employee then went around the frac tanks where there had been several roustabout trucks parked. While passing through the area, the employee struck a vise mounted on the front of a roustabout truck, causing damage to the vehicle. Causal factors here are inattention from our driver. The driver failed to do all they could to ensure the pathway was clear prior to travel. Corrective actions here are to ensure that the route is clear of obstructions prior to driving a vehicle through the area. Also, it should be noted the employee was on location for a while prior to needing to move the vehicle. Use this time wisely and discuss future needs with others on location so that everyone's prepared when the time comes. This slide shows pictures of the damage to our Wildcat vehicle following the event. The final event we'll review is a non-preventable vehicle incident out of Waynesburg, Pennsylvania on February 18th, 2019. Our employee was rounding a curve on a narrow two-lane road when they were struck by a third party. The third party was found to have left their lane and was found at fault for the incident. There were no injuries, but the Wildcat vehicle was damaged. Causal factors here are inattention by the third-party driver. While there are no corrective actions for Wildcat in this event, it is still a lesson demonstrating a need to increase our awareness around third parties while we are driving. This slide shows pictures from the scene of the incident as well as damage to our vehicle and the third party's vehicle. Now let's take a look at our observation card information we've collected through 2019 so far. Looking at the observation count year over year, you can see that most of our facilities have already exceeded their 2018 numbers. This top graph, again the black, is 2018, and the yellow line represents total observations for 2019. The bottom graph is an actual bar graph of the count of observations. We've had a total of 93 observations since beginning the program in October of 2018. We are now averaging 19 observations per month, which is up 4 observations from last month, which we were averaging 15. This is great work, guys. Keep it up. Looking at the detail found in our observation cards, we see that 27% of them center around the use of personal protective equipment. 23% of the observations in February were centered around the use of personal protective equipment. 18% of these observations around use of PPE were listed as an acceptable behavior, meaning that all PPE was in place and being used properly. This is great work and shows the corrective nature of observations because of the increased awareness around the proper use of protective equipment. As we talked about last month, we see a direct correlation in number of observations versus incidents. The higher the observation count, the lower the incident count. We had a 33% decrease in observations in February versus January. We experienced a 50% increase in incidents in February versus January. Again, don't ignore this correlation. A decrease in observations will equal an increase in incidents. A look at observations where stop work authority was used begins with an unacceptable behavior centered around the use of PPE around the head of the employee. While on location, it was observed the derrick hand was going back into the derrick without safety glasses or a hard hat on. This was a non-Wildcat employee. Stop work authority was used and the derrick hand was asked to put on his proper PPE, which he did. The next observation was an unacceptable behavior specific to body position with our eyes on task or hands. While tripping out of the hole on a drilling rig, the driller pulled the drilling jars through the rotary table. The driller then stopped as the drilling jars were cocked. An employee, again non-Wildcat employee, placed his hand on the mandrel. Stop work authority was used, and it was explained to this employee that if the jar were to go off, the area he placed his hand would instantly have closed, crushing or amputating it. The next observation was an unacceptable condition, specifically around an electrical hazard. While rigging up, the guy lines for the workover rig became entangled with some electrical conduit. Stop work authority was used, and the lines were untangled to ensure no hazard was present. The next is an unacceptable behavior, specifically body position around line of fire. A non-Wildcat employee walked over pressurized line while testing casing. Again, we used stop work authority, and the worker was told to walk around the equipment and not over the lines. An unacceptable behavior, again with body positioning line of fire, happened when an employee was standing under an aerial man lift while work was being conducted overhead. Stop work authority was used and the employee was moved from the drop zone. Let's look at a couple of additional key observations. The first is an unacceptable condition around procedures and standards not being followed. A crane was observed with a suspended load unattended. The load was lowered and a meeting was held to determine how this happened. It was learned the employee was preparing for a job that had to go out ASAP and in haste left the load suspended. Again, no load should be suspended while not under the supervision of an employee. The last observation we'll look at is an unacceptable condition, again around procedures and standards not being followed. A forklift was found unattended with the forks in an elevated position. The forks were lowered and a meeting was held to discuss the need to ensure the forks were lowered anytime a forklift was unattended. Now let's take a look at asbestos, what it is, how it can harm us, and how to protect ourselves. So what is asbestos? Asbestos is a fibrous material commonly added to building materials to improve thermal and acoustical properties. Asbestos presents a health hazard when the fibers become airborne. When inhaled, airborne fibers can lodge in the lung, causing cancer. Asbestos is broken down into two categories, friable and non-friable asbestos. Friable materials are materials which can be easily crumbled or pulverized by hand pressure. Conversely, non-friable cannot be easily crumbled or pulverized by hand pressure. Personal protective equipment suitable for use around asbestos are NIOSH-approved half-face respirators with a P100 HEPA filter. To use this type of equipment would require medical evaluation and a fit test for the employee. You should also use disposable impermeable coveralls, commonly referred to as Tyvek coveralls, and other PPE appropriate for other hazards present in the work site. Procedures for removal or work activities associated with asbestos range from moderate to severe and shall only be performed by a licensed third party. You should follow these four principles when encountering an asbestos work environment. 1. Isolate the area, then protect workers from the area, minimize the release of fibers, and ensure that adequate cleanup and decontamination occurs. Equipment you would need to respond to an asbestos release would be caution tape and warning signs, 6mm polyethylene drop sheets, a HEPA vacuum, duct tape, a spray bottle with water which will keep the surface wet and keep fibers to a minimum, and a 5-gallon pail of water for rags and water for the cleanup. Additional work procedures include isolating the area with a 10-foot radius using your tape and barriers. You should designate wash areas adjacent to the work area, including a 5-gallon pail of clean water, soap, and clean washcloths. Make sure you've notified your supervisor and HSE if there is an asbestos release, and also do not enter the area without proper respirator and protective clothing. When cleaning a contaminated area, you should spray the area with water to keep fibers from becoming airborne. Use a HEPA vacuum or wet wipe the area, placing the rags in asbestos waste bags. Remove all gross contamination from the outer layer of the Tyvek coveralls and boot covers and place them also in the asbestos waste bag. Wash your hands, face, and exterior of your respirator and inspect the area to ensure no residual asbestos remains. Do not eat, drink, smoke, or chew gum or tobacco while inside the work area. Now let's learn a bit about benzene, what it is and how it can hurt us. Benzene is a clear liquid made of petroleum. It's useful in making other chemicals and is also highly flammable. But mostly what benzene represents to us is it's a carcinogen or cancer-causing agent. Benzene is typically found in refineries, chemical plants, or anywhere gasoline is transferred, including gas stations. Health hazards associated with exposure to benzene include dizziness, headache, and feeling high. A sense of confusion, unconsciousness can occur at high levels, damage to the blood system, and or leukemia, also known as blood cancer, for exposures over a long period of time. Benzene typically enters the body by inhalation or through absorption through the skin. If benzene levels are above the OSHA limits, you should wear respirators that are assigned to you. You should also wear gloves and goggles if you're working with liquid benzene or liquid solvents containing benzene. You should also wash your hands prior to eating, drinking, smoking, or using the restroom. If there's a large spill or release of benzene, you should leave the area immediately. Do not attempt to clean the spill unless you're trained to do so, and be sure to notify your supervisor immediately. Now let's discuss journey management, how to keep yourself safe before you ever even start your trip. Before we get into journey management, a quick look at our incidents in 2019 that have involved vehicles show that 75% of them involve third parties. 50% are non-preventable and 50% have been preventable. 100% of the vehicle incidents in the month of February did involve a third party. Journey management is the process of planning your trip before you even start it. Wildcat Oil Tools' journey management requirements require the employee to contact their supervisor for guidance before attempting to drive in any inclement weather conditions. Hazardous conditions do not cause incidents. Decisions and actions cause incidents. Employees and management will be accountable for all decisions and actions taken specifically around driving in inclement weather. While on location, employees should always monitor conditions. Conditions can change, and these conditions can affect your ability to safely operate a vehicle when you leave location. Conditions to pay particular attention to are high winds, ice and or snow, extreme cold, extreme heat, visibility such as lighting, fog, and or heavy rain. Employees should also make every effort to plan their trips and daily routes in an effort to avoid traffic, avoid construction zones, avoid low water crossings, and to avoid any other known or predictable hazard. In the event these hazards cannot be avoided, the employees to use extreme caution when operating your vehicle around them. Thanks again for your attention, and be safe out there, taking care of yourself and others.